Good. Okay. Yeah, it's interesting to be the last speaker. I know you've had some fresh air, so I hope you can stay awake a few more minutes. I work for the Uppsala Centre for Sustainable Development as a director of that centre, which is administratively under Uppsala University, but is actually co-owned by Uppsala University and the Swedish University of the Agricultural Sciences. And our role is very much as a meeting place, a network, and a catalyst. So you could say at a small scale we're a little bit similar to BUP, but working within those two university settings. And we're not only a catalyst for people within universities, where we work very much at the interface of universities and society at large. And I think this is a point that was taken up in the plenary discussion, and our role in terms of working with those sort of things. I'm going to talk about, I'm actually replacing an earlier speaker, so there's lots of replacement of speakers here. Daniela Tilbury, who had the title Sustainability Leadership. I'm choosing to use the title Leadership for Sustainable Development. And I want to sort of consider ourselves as people from a university setting and the role we have as sustainable development leaders in my presentation. And I think before we go on, I think we need to think about our history or our legacy, where we've come from as people from institutions of higher learning, which is very, very much shaped around a particular role that we've had in the past, and it's perhaps changing. And I just want to postulate or mention a few assumptions here that we've probably had very much in our work previously as students and then as employees at universities. And I think we work under the belief that our scientific practice enables us to actually identify issues pertaining to what our particular endeavour, in this case sustainable development. I think we also we assume that we're able to set boundaries around those systems where we actually find those issues. I think we also often have this assumption as researchers that we have this belief that we can actually identify an ideal state for a particular system or a desirable state for a particular system. And science can actually define the state. Our methodologies, our role as scientists help us to actually define it. And perhaps even determine how to achieve this state. So those are sort of underlying assumptions that we come in with as scientists, in terms of at least the problems and issues that we've worked with in the past. But are these assumptions a good fit when it comes to working with sustainable development issues? Are these the sort of assumptions that we should be working with as sustainability or sustainable development leadership actors? So we have our assumptions, and then we have perhaps what's going on in terms of sustainable development at different scales. And if we begin with this global sustainability narrative, many of you may have heard about the planetary boundaries concept, where a group of researchers from the Resilience Centre have, in a very sort of tidy fashion, attempted to sort of put a boundary around that operating space where we should be, we should be staying in terms of humanity. So they have on our behalf identified this desirable state that we as humans should be sort of living within. And that particular planetary boundaries narrative also reflects very much the new discussion about Earth systems and the fact that we have entered the Anthropocene. That we can now, in space, look at our planet and actually see our ecological footprint. on the planet. We can visibly see it from space now. And they've got a number of parameters there. I'm not going to go into detail in terms of those parameters, but what they are suggesting is that we have gone beyond those boundaries, those planetary boundaries, in terms of a number of parameters. And the area in green is that planetary space, and you can see we've certainly exceeded that space in terms of biodiversity loss and nitrogen and even CO2. Another narrative, and I would like to call this now the sustainable development narrative as opposed to the sustainability narrative that Rockstrom and others were talking about, is the narrative of the new Sustainable Development Goals. And I found it very interesting actually in the presentation of the sort of Horizon 2020, because in terms of the societal challenges theme, those societal challenges and the theme areas actually reflect very much the proposed new Sustainable Development Goals that actually will replace the old Millennium Development Goals as of the end of this coming year. So that's interesting and something to reflect upon, perhaps as the Baltic University program, that we haven't got it too far wrong if we're looking at sustainable development as an area, because it's becoming certainly manifest in terms of the global narrative, and we see that the research funders are beginning to orientate themselves towards that as well. But what is interesting here, when we put these two different global narratives together, there is a tension in trying to achieve multiple sustainability goals and at the same time achieve development goals. There are tensions and there are indeed controversies and conflicts of interest in achieving those simultaneously as society. What about local sustainability narratives within local contexts? And these two pictures here depict, in fact, three different storylines from stakeholders in this particular system. As an Australian, I have problems in pronouncing the name Kristianstad, but it's in southern Sweden, and indeed the rector of Uppsala University from the south would have been able to pronounce it perfectly. But we see different and conflicting storylines within the same system of interest here in this particular context. On the right-hand side, we see the city of Kristianstad, which is experiencing real infrastructural problems in terms of these periodic flood events or flood episodes that run through the city that create enormous damage and enormous cost to the city. And outside the city, you have a wetland system in which you have farming practices. And though, of course, as farmers, your stake in the system is looking at the agronomic potential of that system, which creates forms of land use and practice that is in conflict with the interests of the city, and in fact, probably exacerbate those flooding episodes in the city. These wetlands are also very important for those interested in one of those planetary boundaries, biodiversity. And one needs to have open wetland systems that receive these unregulated flooding events to increase species richness or biodiversity. So we have three conflicting storylines here. Again, we have that complexity and a type of issue that is not easily reconciled with a single solution. The types of solutions that we perhaps have been best delivering as scientists in universities in the past. The phenomena of the flying pigs is also an interesting, more regional level narrative, sustainable development narrative within the Baltic Sea region. And this phenomena, basically the story goes in this way, that in countries like Denmark and Germany, which are highly regulated in terms of the environment, it's become increasingly difficult for the pig industry to maintain productivity and effectivity under those. It's becoming a rather costly exercise for the pig industry to stay in those countries. On top of that, not so long ago in Denmark, they started implementing something called the fat tax as a way of, at least in theory, reducing obesity in Denmark. But this fat tax punished the pig industry quite seriously. All of a sudden it was taxed. So because of that, pigs in both Denmark and Germany grew wings. And the pig industry flew out of those contexts into less regulated contexts. They landed in Poland, which was still within the EU regulatory context, but they flew outside the EU into less regulated contexts, like Belarus and Russia, in particular Kaliningrad. So there you find the Danish and German pig industry maintaining its industry, but actually flying offshore into contexts that were better for them. When you see this from a regional perspective, it hasn't. Whilst it may have solved sustainable development issues within national borders, it has not solved the problem at a regional level, because we still have dirty industries polluting the same water body, which is the Baltic Sea, that is a common water body. In fact, it probably has exacerbated the problem. So again, we have this dilemma or this issue in terms of the sustainable development narrative, that we can create a solution at one level but exacerbate the problem or move the problem when we go up in terms of a scale to the regional level. If we think about a trans-regional sustainability narrative that we're part of here in the Baltic Sea region, that's in terms of how we in a region choose to implement the Renewable Energy Directive, which is promoting renewable energy as a replacement to these sort of dirty, carbon-intensive energy sources. And what this picture is meant to depict is again showing how our actions, trying to clean up our act within the Baltic Sea region, is incurring a cost in another context. And as a response to the Renewable Energy Directive, we saw intensive renewable energy initiatives emerging outside Europe, and in particular in Southeast Asia, and in this case Eastern Kalimantan in Indonesia, but also in Ethiopia and other countries, where they began growing biocrops, and in this case palm oil, to supply the Baltic Sea region with renewable energy sources. And from a sustainable development perspective within these countries, the cost was very, very high, or is and continues to be very high. So again, as responsible Europeans in the Baltic Sea region, we are attempting to address sustainable development concerns within our region, but we're simply shifting the problem to another context or another region. We're not really cleaning it up. I'm going to jump over this issue, I think, because I'm running out of time. But one final narrative I'd like to sort of mention here is our attempt to actually sort of implement a sustainable development action, and thinking and critiquing our way of actually implementing that action. And this is a storyline in terms of the implementation of the Water Framework Directive, which is a very interesting and innovative new directive, because it builds in a concern about the quality of water, good quality water, but it's also attempting to think beyond water itself and how water affects other sectors and other systems within the Baltic Sea region. So the target is not only good quality water, but it also is stakeholder participation. So they are two dual targets under a single directive. And in Sweden, at least, it is the responsibility of the municipalities to actually implement this directive. And there is a fair degree of adaptation at the municipal level in terms of implementation. And there has been a study recently looking at how the directive has been implemented in Sweden, in the municipalities. And some very interesting results have actually emerged, particularly if you're interested in the equity side of sustainable development. And what we see in these municipalities is, in terms of the good quality water part of it, there are certain actors within municipalities that are responsible for that. And that tends to be men, approximately my age, middle-aged men, scientists who are responsible for the good quality water side of the implementation of that directive. And nearly exclusively, those that are responsible for the other half of the directive, stakeholder participation, are young women who have just finished their education. And this creates an incredible distortion in the actual implementation of the directive. And where there is real traction in the directive's implementation happens to be with these men who are my age. And the stakeholder participation side of things become less important in the implementation process. So not only is the complexity happening in terms of how we're seeing this mismatch in terms of actually implementation of actions, the policy level, but actually in the implementation process itself, we're seeing a whole lot of complexity and mess. So what do these storylines tell us? I think in terms of our original assumption that we have been working with at universities, in fact, it's probably difficult to say that we as universities can define these systems, because in fact different stakeholders see different systems and they see different constraints. And I think, so there isn't a single system, we're actually seeing different systems at different scales and across different sectors. This means that our role as scientists then becomes that we are actually transformed into stakeholders, because we will have to elect a particular system that we want to keep it in that particular state that we want to see it in. We see that power is present in these systems and it actually distorts our actions in different ways. And as leaders in university settings, then when we're tackling sustainable development, we're actually faced with a whole host of dilemmas, or what's often referred to as wicked problems. So I think probably in terms of the governance that we need to think about, or the change that we need to think about that grows out of our understanding as actors within university settings, we can perhaps see it in 4 different ways. The first picture depicts perhaps the way we are used to operating in university settings, where we have previously at least approached a rather reductionist way to bring about change, whether we are sitting within our own disciplinary schools or disciplinary settings and trying to optimise a particular change process around that. And that way of working is not only within the walls of universities, it's very coherent in terms of how we see policy and governance more generally. It's very siloed and it's very sector orientated, and there's rather little interaction or communication between those silos. And An example within the Baltic Sea region is the implementation of the Nitrates Directive. That would be a governance action that would reflect this rather sort of siloed way of actually implementing change, where the key optimisation is around reducing leaching of nitrates into the Baltic Sea. So we're quite good at working in that way, but whether that is addressing sustainable development is another question. In terms of B, what we're seeing here is actually lifting the level to a more systemic sort of way of viewing the system. We've spoken very much today about what is our defining property as BUP, and the defining property is the drainage basin. So we're using a hard boundary, the drainage basin, to define some common actions. And the Baltic Sea Action Plan is an example perhaps of a common policy that has that particular approach, where we're defining our reference system and our way of operating with a hard boundary around it. Point C is something that is rather unfamiliar to us in universities, but it's been taken up a little bit today. And that's where the walls around universities are no longer bounded, but we see our universities become more like open universities, where the expertise does not lie just inside universities, but it's also the expertise lie in the authorities and the stakeholders that are situated outside universities as well. And it's an acknowledgement that there are legitimate systems that are seen by stakeholders also outside university settings. And here we see permeable boundaries that can be negotiated and are defined by different sets or different constellations of stakeholders. The final approach, potentially, in terms of governance is the D. And I think, if I remember rightly, when the rector of Uppsala University actually opened the day, she said, keep calm and carry on, with a recognition that we have such different value systems and we have such different worldviews within the Baltic Sea region. It's in fact probably impossible to reconcile all our differences and create some totally common boundary around ourselves. And I would see, probably, depending on the sustainable development issue, that where we're heading towards is either C or D. And trying to work in that fashion as universities. Given the storylines we've heard, how do we now rethink how we conceptualise sustainable development as a lens to help us perhaps redefine the role universities should be having in working with sustainable development? And what we see from those storylines is that clearly there are a whole host of systemic interdependencies within the system. We may be able to solve a problem at one level, but because its solution is interlinked or interdependent at another scale, it could be having a different type of impact. So we need to be acutely aware of those interdependencies, both within the Baltic Sea region, but also beyond. Because our actions here are affecting actions and improvements or constraints elsewhere. We see complexity within the system in the sense that there are not necessarily causal impacts in the system or cause and effect. There can be lags in these systems, and this makes our job even more complex. We see a high degree of uncertainty in terms of the future, and we hear that very much in terms of this narrative, in terms of climate change. So we don't really know what to expect in the future, and we need to take that into account. And of course, even if we get our science right and we can address interdependencies, complexity and uncertainty, the emergent implementation process to bring about change on the back of that can be distorted by power in the system. It's going to be a very imperfect implementation process, and we need to be aware of that. All of that, those collectively make the types of problems we're working with even more wicked, or that level of controversy that we need to deal with even greater. The question is, coming in with that particular perspective, are our university structures well suited to deal with that type of conceptualisation of sustainable development? And this particular university, and I'm not going to name it, is not a Baltic Sea region university. It's outside the Baltic Sea region, so you shouldn't be disturbed, but I think it possibly reflects a little bit in terms of how universities are structured. And we see the clear silos, which is not strange that universities are reproducing those silos in terms of society outwardly. And I'm wondering if universities are perhaps exacerbating sustainable development impacts, not necessarily in a positive sense, but in a negative sense, because it is these silos that seem to be the problem that we're facing in terms of sustainable development presently. So it's a reflection. I mean, our structures well suited to dealing with these types of wicked issues that we see ourselves in. Just as a final note before we finish off, this is another way of potentially viewing a university. It's a picture that many of my colleagues are becoming very familiar with now because I keep pushing it towards them. But it reflects another mode of working within a university setting. The example comes from recent news that we have had that a large philanthropist from the private sector, Nicholas Zenström, has decided to support a series of guest professors in climate change leadership. And Uppsala University is very excited about this initiative at all levels and across all silos within the university, because the different departments and the different disciplines can actually see that they can contribute to this area of endeavour. They believe that they could make a potential contribution. The challenge we have within a university setting when we have that university structure is how can we pull this information together, all these important insights in terms of climate change leadership, into a coherent storyline so we can actually affect change. And what we see at the bottom end of the picture is many of the areas that could actually contribute to this collective storyline in terms of climate change leadership. That's apparent within Uppsala University and the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. We need to be able to lift those areas into this coherent storyline using an understanding of climate change leadership as the organising principle. So there needs to be a platform created across these silos to do that. And we recognise that in an area like climate change leadership, it's not enough to think that the expertise from the university and the understanding from the university will fully address that particular area. So we also need to, and that you see that in the blue area, to recognise that in terms of this particular area, we need to see the university as an open university that is, in fact, going to draw on stakeholders outside the university setting and the knowledge of stakeholders outside that university setting to create a more powerful and more relevant storyline in terms of climate change leadership. So we will need to engage in a co-production process with knowledge traditions from university and beyond in this area. And our hope is by doing that, we'll actually make a real contribution to change in the area. So I'd just like to leave you with, to finish off with the sort of local example again, and say, well, in fact, what actually happened in Kristianstad, because I didn't finish the story here. Yes, there were conflicts of interest between those interested in increasing their agronomic potential, those thinking about biodiversity, and those thinking about protecting the city. What happened here in this particular system was, rather than using the formal policy frameworks, the local community took action themselves, and Kristianstad is now actually paying farmers outside the city to become flood farmers. So their new form of farming is flood farming, and they're designing their farming practices in such a way that actually they can help regulate the water flow in the system, so it's not having an impact on the city. And one way, or one important means of regulating it, is re-establishing this, what was previously this very sophisticated wetland system, or natural wetland system around the city, rather than drained farmland. So those interested in biodiversity are also very happy, because these wetland systems are very good from a species richness perspective. But what was required here was facilitation, communication and dialogue between these different actors. Not necessarily scientific experts coming into the system. And in fact, the scientists in this particular system became the facilitators of this process. So that's all from me, Paolo. Yep.